All right, so I'm going to start with just a little archaeology, then we'll finish up the lesson that we started about reading through the text. Right. So here is the question to start. Why would it be there is no, or there's not much evidence of David or Solomon? So this is something that a lot of secular people will point to. Now, obviously, there was something in the last 10 years or so that was found that did have the house of David written on it. But other than that, there's not much that has come down to us from either one of these individuals, which is the glory days of the kingdom, right, would be David and Solomon. And so we have corroboration from about 853 on forward, so counting down, we have a lot of information about both the Israelite kings and the kings of Judah from about that point forward. David was around 1,000 into Solomon being into the 900. So this is after the division of the monarchy, we begin to have a lot more evidence, and so you'll get a lot of secular historians that then try and say, well, that must mean that these glory days were a fictional thing because all we have is this divided monarchy. And so you get a lot of people that use the fact that there is not much archaeological evidence to support these two areas to say that means that they didn't exist. And so just a couple of things on that about why there wouldn't be that much evidence from them. So any thoughts? I have about 2 or 3 things, but any thoughts on why we wouldn't have found too much stuff? All right. Well, all of those were almost right. They were all pretty close.
Are we close?
Yeah.
Yes, safe thoughts.
That'll make you sound better on the tape.
Yeah.
And I say, oh, those were close. All those were. You almost had it. Okay, so a couple of things. One, anybody know where the majority of our findings, even about these nations, have come from? We talked a little bit about some of this stuff in previous classes. We've talked about there was an obelisk found that had a picture of one of the kings of Israel on it. That was found in Assyria. And so this is a major reason why we haven't found too much, because most of the discoveries even that we have not been things that have been unearthed in Israel. These are things that surrounding nations wrote that have been discovered in archaeological digs. That is why there's all this other validation from 853 forward. All of those areas, just about every king of Israel or Judah has been found to be mentioned somewhere. But most of those are not within the nation of Israel. Most of them come from archaeological digs in Assyria, because Assyria kept very detailed records of all of their military campaigns, of all of their financial dealings, all of that kind of stuff. Assyria was very involved in that. But during the time of David and Solomon, Assyria had not moved into this area yet. And so Assyria was still further back. They had not crossed over and had much dealings at all with David or Solomon. And so there's nothing in their records because they weren't interacting with them at that point. And so the archaeological findings from Assyria do shed a ton of light on Israel, but the fact that they don't shed any on David and Solomon is probably attested to the fact that Assyria wasn't even really in this region during that time, right? And so it's not like they've done all this digging. That's how people will present this if they don't really understand what's going on. It's not like they've done all this digging and all these other kingdoms in Israel have been clearly identified through these dig sites, and it's just only David and Solomon that haven't been done. Most of these dig sites, you're not getting these names and these types of things. It's from the Assyrian records, where they had dealings with all of the Israelite kings in the northern 10 tribes, and then many of the kings in Judah. And then also you get Babylonian records and things like that. So there's a lot of surrounding nations. The other thing that people won't point out is that I want to say only maybe one king of the Ammonites has there been anything found. Or no, it was the Moabites. There was one king of the Moabites. No kings of the Ammonites. No kings of the Edomites. Has there been anything found about any of them either? Right. So from this time period, it's not just David and Solomon. We don't have anything from anybody much during this time period of any of those kings. So the reason that the surrounding nations, us not finding any of their kings, the reason that's important is because clearly there were people that were living there. We've got the ruins are there. So if mention of their kings from that same time period has not come down, then it's not out of the realm of possibility to understand that it happened the same way over here. And then part of that, as we've said, is because it was the record keeping of Assyria, which didn't come down in until about 100 years after David and Solomon. That is where we really start getting more detailed records. And then, keep in mind then also that this is a very war-torn area to begin with. And so Solomon's temple and David's palaces and all that stuff were all destroyed and rebuilt on top of multiple times, just in the biblical timeline. And then add in all of the chaos of the Crusades, which was taking place in the same area, that you just got tons of upheaval. And so you're really not in any of this area, whether in Israel or the surrounding areas where the Edomites, the Moabites, the Ammonites, all of those areas, we're not getting anything really of their kings either. And a big part of that is just there were so many people in these areas, and it was always such a battlefield. Whereas, a lot of parts of Assyria were not as hotly contested through the years as this part was. It was so much a bigger area. Everything kind of climaxes right there in Israel because it was such a key spot for trade, because it connected the worlds of Egypt, Northern Europe, Turkey, and all of those areas up there, and then Mesopotamia and east all the way over. So anyways, because of their area, it's always been hotly contested. And then the fact that it's the one area where God's people genuinely were, and so the enemy also was hotly contesting these areas. And so that's a big part
Could it be that
of
the
it.
enemy surrounding the nations destroyed any evidence of them, or was
Carried off
that
anything of value, I'm sure.
Yeah, well, the things of value were carried off. In the fights and in the battles, a lot of cities were destroyed. And so, through the years, that's kind of what I mean is along the way, there's been so many battles here that the main cities were often decimated, just like how they did with Solomon's temple. And then you wouldn't expect to find it in the suburbs, people having many types of plaques or something with the king's name on it. That's not something that farmers normally had. Anyways, and so it'd be something on like the buildings. They would scribe the king's name on a particular building or something. And then one other thought is it's not entirely clear whether David even thought much about putting his name on things? Was that an arrogant kind of thing in the eyes of a godly people to say this is my thing, as opposed to this being just the Lord's stuff. So it's not entirely clear whether David would have even been putting his name on a bunch of things or not. Yeah, and then the other thing is, and then the Assyrians kept good records of their enemies. They kept a lot of good records that we found. And then the other thing is the Egyptians did not keep good records. They kept good records, but they refused to put people's proper names in there because they felt like it was honoring them. And so the Egyptians wouldn't put the name of their enemy most of the time in their records. So yeah, they didn't want them to live into eternity, because they think that if I inscribe your name in this stone, then that makes a memorial of you into eternity. So if they talked about the battle, they wouldn't put your name there because they didn't want you to last into eternity, by carving it into this stone. Then one of the other things, which I'm sure is what you guys were alluding to when you guys were silent a minute ago, is a possible argument of silence that during the time of David and Solomon, we don't hear of any of these surrounding nations. There are no records of battles or any of that kind of stuff, which you could take that two ways. You could say, well, there's no records of it, so these things must not be true. Or you could say that perhaps there's not many records of battles going on during this time because the Bible said Solomon had peace all around. And that really could be really what you would expect, is not to have had many of these records of enemy nations wanting to advance during this time because of the fact that there were such a glorious kingdom and that God's blessing was on them. And so I think part of why you don't hear from these surrounding nations recording anything during this time is because the Bible says that none of them were engaging with them at this time because God had given them peace. So in some ways, it's an argument from silence, but it is, the argument that, there's not a whole lot that's being recorded in surrounding areas about this period. That could reflect the fact that that they weren't at war with many of these people during that time.
So a lot of the other records in the other countries
were about battles. Yeah. So whenever they would do battles. Now, you would think that there could be some records out there about trade. That would be something that we would expect to find, although, just so much of Israel has not been excavated. They're doing like 10 or 12 dig sites, but they're going back, 50 to 70 years every year. It's taken them a long time they haven't even scratched the surface on most of the stuff that's there. And then you look at Jerusalem, most of that's been built over. It's a whole metropolitan area there now. And so probably a lot of the stuff that would have had David and Solomon's name, you would think would have been right there in the hub of Jerusalem. But there's skyscrapers there now. There's all kinds of stuff there. So who knows what's been lost in the modernization of Jerusalem.
And you would think that because the Bible talks about Solomon, his wealth and his the knowledge about him was known, it was well known that he was very wise and that he had a lot of wealth. And you think somebody would have made a record of that.
Yeah.
Unless, again, they just didn't want to admit or give him any credit, really. But
right. So you would think that some of this stuff would be out there more than it is. Although I do think that in Ethiopia, there is some evidence. The Ethiopians still, a lot of a big part of the country is still Old Testament Jewish. They have the temple, they have the high priest, they have the sacrifices, and a lot of that is because the Queen of Sheba went back to that area, brought that type of stuff. So they still even today practice Old Testament religion in Ethiopia. So in a way that kind of validates, even if they're not mentioning his name, the Bible says that they got that from him. And then the other thing is, I don't know that we have a whole lot of stuff from very many people at all during this time period, 1,000 years before the Lord. There's just not a whole lot of information from that time period. You know.
Makes you wonder, wasn't anybody ambitious enough to make a record of it?
Well, yeah, no. So it's not that there were no records. It's just they haven't come down to us, right? Yeah. So it's not that during all of Solomon's life that nobody was writing about him. It's just these things haven't come down to us. It could be a couple of things. One, it could be anything that was inscribed in stone was more for buildings, and all of those were destroyed. And then any of the books that they wrote, how did the Israelite culture write their books? What material did they use? Some kind of scroll, right? So not stone that would come down to us. And so a lot of their records were done in this format, in that culture. So none of the writings would have come down to us where they would have recorded this type of stuff. So some other nations like Assyria did more things with stone tablets. The Bible tends to lean towards the fact that they were using scroll.
What age did they place on those?
The Dead Sea Scrolls were 200 BC to the time of Christ.
Way after that period of time.
So I don't know that there's hardly been anything from David's time or before. There's not much at all in terms of writing that's come from these time periods. Although there is some stuff. The tablets of Ebla are traced back to the time of Abraham. And then there's some other things that have come down to us, but there's not a whole lot of actual writing from this time period that has survived. The Dead Sea Scrolls only survived because they were sealed in clay tablets and then placed in the desert. And so it was the fact that they were sealed in something and not exposed to the elements is what. And even then, they're just fragments. If the Dead Sea Scrolls are not clearly able to be read. They're fragments that are put side by side, and they kind of figure out what the thing was talking about. But it's not like it's in good shape either. But those were 2,000 years old. These would be 3,000, and so even they had found a silver scroll in an excavation in Jerusalem. But it's rusted shut, and so you can't read what it says because it's rusted shut. So even when they did find some stuff and that was only from like 700, so it's a little further in. But even then, that one was rusted. So the major way that they were writing in this culture, because the scribes were a big part of that nation, which meant you were writing it from one to the next. So scrolls became really important, I would think, during some of this time. Now we know that at least during Moses' time, that he was at least familiar with that older style of writing it on tablets because he wrote the Ten Commandments on stone tablets.
So the Egyptians, they did a lot of carving and stone on tablets.
The Egyptian did a lot of, So he would have, obviously gotten some from that. So Moses would have clearly gotten some from, at least those styles of things from the Egyptians. So who knows how he wrote the Pentateuch? What he did for that, whether he had written it on a scroll. Eventually, we know it rounded up in scroll form because it was called the Book of the Law. And so they were pulling it out. It seems like quite a bit to make it on a stone tablet of some kind. But so anyways, just kind of interesting things that these things, they haven't found much from them. Practical reasons why. And it's not, which is the same reason why the kings from Moab, which clearly there was a nation of Moab there, and the kings from the nation of Edom and Ammon were all clear nations. I mean, the ruins are there. It's clearly that there were nations there for thousands of years. But we don't have any evidence from their kings from this time period either. And so I think a lot of it is the types of materials and that kind of stuff, and then the lack of Assyrian records.
What about the Philistines and the Canaanites? The Canaanites were there before before.
Yeah, we don't have a whole lot from the Canaanites. Some of the earlier Hittite tribes from Abraham's time is that nation of Ebla, the city of Ebla. And, I mean, there's like 17,000 tablets in their library that were discovered. And then...
So they're like what, clay or stone or something?
Yeah. Yeah, they weren't scrolls. But so that was the nation of Ebla kept theirs on stone, and that was going back to, they would have been one of the first nations to rise up after the flood. That Hittite empire immediately after the flood would have been Ebla, and then the Bible even says that that then when it talks about Ebla, makes a specific mention about them. I want to say that that's Genesis 6. Okay. There's a genealogy in here where it talks about, it actually gives the name of Ebla. I think it must be 11 here. Yeah, I have to look it up later. Anyways, Eber, I guess, is actually what it says. So Eber,
Where are you?
Genesis 11. So this is the generations immediately after the flood. So this one in 14 through 16, where it's talking about Eber, he is the one. Trying to read and talk at the same time, but he is the one. I believe that when they found the tablets there in Ebla, it lists the founder of Ebla as a man named Eber. And so it is most likely, because the time period matches up exactly, it is most likely this Eber that it's talking about. And then there's another place in here that I don't have off my hand that talks about, it makes a specific mention that all of that those people came from him. And so we also get then possibly the Hebrews from Eber. And so anyway, so there was a lot of, yeah, go ahead.
Some of the names that they used back during that time were characteristics or traits of the people. Like say, if somebody portrayed anger issues.
So what came first, the name or the personality?
Could they have said, this is the family of the angry man, so angry man, kind of, you know what I mean?
Yeah, so for one, they didn't have last names like how we do. So they only had the first name. I guess the question that I'm not sure that anybody fully knows, at least if they do, I'm not aware of it, is whether these names were given in adulthood.
But you know how they said son of?
Right. Right. So what I'm saying is, let's take, for example, Noah. He will save his people, is what his name means, that kind of thing. So the question is, was he named that in the very beginning and it was prophetic, or once he saved these people, did people start calling him Noah because of what he had done? So because if the person's name is given to them at the beginning, then even though it's a characteristic, nobody knew they were going to have that characteristic until they became adults. So
Kind of like Jacob, like his mother.
yeah,
She named
so
him,
Jacob
a
means
baby.
so Jacob means trickster.
Yeah.
But they named him that as a child, and so is it prophetic or did some of these people get named as an adult? I really don't know. The Bible doesn't tell us, at least the pre-flood people. But the people that were named, that were prophetic, like Moses, it seems like they named them right from the beginning, even though Moses' name means to draw out. He was given that at the very beginning, because he's drawn out of the river, and then it ended up being prophetic. So could some people have been named that way? Possibly. I know definitely later on in life, some people kind of got known by their particularly kings or something. So Melchizedek, that's actually a two-part name. So Zedek was a formal title, because then the other king of Jerusalem, when David conquered, and when the Israelites were coming into the Promised Land, was Adoni-Zedek. And so Melchizedek was the king of Jerusalem there. So the Zedek part appears to be some kind of a title that they got. But in terms of whether they were prophetic names or whether they got that as an adult, I really don't know that anybody knows for those earliest people. I'm not sure.
My only reason for asking was that when you're doing research, you might want to research the circumstance by which that name came about.
Yeah,
if that follows through.
Yeah, or because you're not going to know at any point when they named them from looking at the Bible stuff, whether they were named that from birth or whether in adulthood somebody started calling them that. For instance, somebody picks up a nickname as a teenager because of their personality, and then they get called that all the way through. Then in later years, people look back and just assume they were always called that. And so it may not have been prophetic. It may have just been somebody started calling them that in early life when they started to see how they were. So it's really hard to know because the Bible doesn't tell us when these people got their names. But one thing you can do is look up the meaning of a name and see if you see some things that reflect their story within the name. Just speaking of Moses' name, it means to draw out, which I think is kind of interesting because obviously it deals with the fact he was drawn out of the water. And it means that, he helped draw the Israelites out of captivity. This is a Latin word from which we get something going on right now, hopefully.
Education.
Education is the root word for education. It means to draw out. So, just kind of interesting that the word education and the word Moses mean the same thing. And so it's kind of funny that Moses was the one that taught the people how to live, how the law, and how to be the people of God. That Moses was not just their deliverer. Moses was, in many ways, their teacher. He taught them the law. So it's just kind of interesting that the meaning of his name, draw out, is the same as the meaning of education, to draw out. All right.